Appalachia has always been home to some of the strongest women in history, brave women who feared neither man nor beast. Join us as we count down the top 10 mountain women to ever call Appalachia home. Welcome to the top 10 mountain women from Appalachia. Hey everyone, JD Phillips here, and I'm glad you're here as well. Let's get things started. We'll start things off in Scott County, Tennessee, for the true story of Julia Ann Marcum. It's a name that most folks today have never heard of, but I'll tell you this, there was never a tougher woman that ever lived. Kicking off our countdown at number 10, this is Julia's true story.
Julia Ann Marcum. It's probably a name you never heard of. Yet, her story is so remarkable, she became the only female civilian to receive a full pension from the United States after the Civil War. And when she died years later, she received a full military funeral. What did she do that was so courageous to earn these honors? It's a story that's almost been lost to time. And, unfortunately, like many historical events, it isn't taught at any level of our education system. Recently, I opened my mailbox and I found a large envelope full of Julia's military and family records, complete with official copies of special acts of Congress honoring her. However, the most surprising item in that envelope was a letter written in Julia's own words from 1926. Just a few years before she died. I was blown away by her story of bravery and courage. Her story is American history, and it's my honor to share her story with you now. I was born in the year of 1844, the 7th day of November. My father and my mother owned a farm on Waters Buffalo Creek, 4 miles east of Huntsville. My pa made a living as a farmer, and by all accounts, he was a happy, law-abiding Christian man, as was all of our family. My father stood for the flag, the freedom of America, and its perfect laws. In the year 1861, the southern states succeeded against the North, and soon after, President Lincoln declared war on the southern states. My home state of Tennessee was torn apart. Although officially, Tennessee was a part of this new Confederacy, the eastern part of the state was bitterly divided. Where I lived in Scott County, nearly everyone, including my father, supported the Union cause. Soon, the rebels invaded our county, as there were but few rebels in the county. They sent their armies to kill and destroy our men, women, and property. They came to our house and they hunted for my father. They watched day and night, trying to kill him, because he was a Union man for the federal side, and they threatened our family with death if we didn't tell where he was. Then, on the 7th night of September, 1861, at 2 o'clock in the morning, they came to our house, and they broke the door open with bayonets on their guns. We looked out the window, and there were 36 men who surrounded our cabin with torches. They had come to kill my father, and they would kill my mother, my brother, and my 3 sisters, and burn us all in the house. We all began to holler and scream for help. Our house was surrounded. Just one soldier stayed in the house with us. We burned tallow candles back in that day and time. We only had a small piece of a candle, and my sister got hold of a match and she lit it. The soldier picked at us with his bayonet on his gun, and he began to choke my mother. My sister, Dadalma, ran upstairs to get another candle. But the soldier ran upstairs after her. Violently, he grabbed hold of her, and he told her that he would cut her throat and burn us all in the house. She screamed for help, but we were alone, as my father was hiding out on the farm. Paul heard us calling for help, but he couldn't get there fast enough. It was up to us to survive. All the weapons we had in the house were 2 chopping axes, My sister, Minerva, grabbed one axe and I grabbed the other. As soon as I started upstairs, 2 more soldiers burst through the front door. My sister was scared and she threw down her axe. I continued upstairs with the axe to try to save my sister. As soon as I topped the stairs, the rebel struck at me with his bayonet on his gun. But I ran under the gun and I chopped him in the face and his breast with my axe. I cut him to the hollow and I split his chin open with the axe, getting the best of him. I knocked the gun out of his hands. He staggered around and he said, "Don't chop me anymore." But I didn't stop. Somehow, he got a hold of the gun and he stuck the bayonet in my forehead. It burst into my skull and knocked my brains out, put out my left eye, and then he shot off my 3rd finger of my right hand. My father came up the stairs just as the gun fell out of the soldier's hands. Paul shot him in the shoulder and he fell dead. During the scuffle, the light was knocked out. All was in darkness. I was knocked unconscious, and I didn't come to for some time. They got a light, and they brought me back to life. My pa brought me downstairs, and he laid me on the bed, and he took his gun, and he went outside looking for all the rebels, but they had run off. I asked my father to leave, because I knew they'd be back and they'd kill him. So he left us there. My brother went to get somebody to come help us, and as he went into the night, he found the horse that the rebel had ridden there. He got on it and he rode to several houses, begging for help. And finally, one woman named Miss Taylor came with him. My mother told Miss Taylor to tell the colonel what happened and to come take the old dead rebel away. Soon, a man named Captain Gordon came with a company of soldiers, and when he saw me, he sent back to the regiment for their doctors. They dressed my wounds and they took the dead man away. We were left in a terrible fix and at the mercy of the rebels. But they went away. My mother sent and got Dr. Hart to come care for me. He came and he doctored me with all the human care that was in him. Yet, it was 3 months before I was able to get out of the house, and the war still continued. My brother was not strong enough to take up arms. He was just 14 years old. Finally, after 3 months, my father came back home, and he thought he could stay with us. And one day, my cousin and I, we snuck outside when the rebels shot at us. They nearly killed me, and they did kill my cousin. Finally, in the middle of the winter, in January of 1862, they drove us away from our home. We traveled through the snow and the mountains to Kentucky before arriving on the Green River in Casey County. My father went and joined the Federal Army, where he was attached to the 13th East Tennessee Cavalry, and he started the march to the sea. He got as far as Nashville, where he took the smallpox and died. He's buried in the National Cemetery, where his body lays with thousands of his comrades. My family stayed on the Green River for some time, and then we went to Flat Lake, Kentucky. As soon as the war came to an end, my mother died. Soon thereafter, all my sisters married, so I went back to Tennessee to live. I taught school for the next 12 years until my health broke down from the wounds that I received from the rebel soldier. I couldn't teach anymore, and I couldn't work anymore. In 1884, I petitioned the Congress to grant me a pension, and on October 15th, 1885, they passed a special act granting me a pension during my life for the sum of $30 a month. Years later, in September of 1922, they increased it to $40 a month. So here I am, the only woman in the United States that draws a pension without the aid of a soldier. There's no other like me. It's glad tidings to me to be remembered. I'm the only woman that's a full member of the Grand Army of the Republic of America. Many of my comrades have passed beyond the river of life. Me? Oh, I've been a member of the church for 70 years. I prepare every day. There is nothing in between me and God when night comes. This is a true story of my war experiences. Julia A. Marcum, Williamsburg, Kentucky. Julia's life was devoted to patriotic and religious work. When she died at the age of 91, she was honored with a military funeral. A historical marker still stands in her honor on the northwest side of the Whitley County, Kentucky courthouse lawn.
What a brave and heroic woman. We salute you and thank you for your service, Miss Marcum. Stick around, folks. Number 9 on our list is coming right up. Our next story comes to us from North Carolina. Perhaps no one in history embodies a true Appalachian spirit more than Dr. Polly Justice King.
I was born on a cold November night in 1819 in Henderson County, North Carolina. The cold mountain air blew without restriction through the cracks between the walls of our cabin, causing the flames to dance back and forth in the fireplace. There was no gathering of relatives or the assistance of a doctor to aid in my safe passage into this world on this night. Instead, it was just my ma and pa working together by the dim light of the fireplace. My tiny voice cried for the first time as my father cut the cord with his pocket knife and placed me in my mother's arms, wrapped in a quilt that she had made from scraps of fabric. A few hours later, the morning sun shone through those same cracks and illuminated my face for my parents to see me for the first time. "Look, Hiram, she's got pretty blue eyes," my mom said, "and she's going to have plenty of smarts. Look how wide her forehead is." My pa nodded in agreement as he studied my face. "A pretty gal like that needs a pretty name. We'll call her Polly." It was in this one-room log cabin that my father had built with his own hands where I'd spend my childhood. My pa's name was Hiram King, and though he was a rugged mountaineer, his father before him had taught him how to read and write as a boy. But the truth is, there was little need for those skills back in those days. For one, we never owned a book in the house other than the Bible. And two, Pa spent his days working sun up to sundown, working the crops and tending the animals and hunting. Heck, by the time he ate supper each night, he was so tired that he didn't have any use for trivial things like reading. It was for that reason that he never taught me to read. Instead, I was raised like all mountain girls back then. We worked harder than the boys. We tended to all the animals and worked the fields just like they did. But we also churned the butter, carried the water, cooked the meals, made the clothes, and tended to the cabin too. By the time I was a teen, I worked circles around all my brothers. Now don't get me wrong, I ain't complaining. This was the reality of life, and we had never met a lazy person. In fact, if there was ever one who existed, I'll tell you this, he wouldn't exist for long back then, because if you didn't do it for yourself, you did without. And I was thankful for the skills that I learned on how to live off the bounty of what nature provided. And Pa, oh, he was a master teacher. He taught me about all the plants and the trees, how to train a good horse, how to hunt, farm, and most of all, how to take care of folks you care about. And it was normal for folks to marry young back then, considering the average lifespan was barely more than 40 years. You had to get an early start, especially if you wanted to be around long enough to see your youngins grow up. So I was married at 16 years old to a fella named John Justice. And folks called him the Peacemaker because he was a gentle soul who never lost his temper, no matter how heated the situation got. He had a way about him and a reputation as a mediator. John could solve disputes between men who were bitter rivals, and many times bloodshed was avoided due to his skills. Just like my mother, and hers before her, there was no such thing as a doctor when my first child was born. Although I was just 16, I handled the birth all by myself, while John was away at work. Yet, within a few days, my son's umbilical cord became infected and wouldn't heal. Now back then, many a child had died because of this, and I was really worried. Each day, it got worse, and he began to get weak, so weak that he could barely eat, and I didn't know what to do, until one night, I had a dream. Now I know some of you folks don't believe in things like this, but I tell you, it's the truth. A voice spoke to me just as clear as I'm speaking to you now, and it told me to go to the woods past Bull's Gap and collect certain herbs that grew on the side of the creek, then to climb to the top of Hawk's Ridge and collect leaves from a sapling that only grew in the shadow of the chestnut tree, then to dig for roots that only grew near a laurel thicket, and then to take the bark of a sassafras tree. The voice told me to bring all of these medicines home and to boil them in water over the fireplace, and once the liquid cooled, to apply it continuously to my son's sore and to keep it wet with the concoction for 3 days. When I opened my eyes from the dream, I knew I had to do exactly what I was told, so I did. I went and gathered the roots, bark, and leaves, and I boiled it just like I was instructed to do. And miraculously, after 3 days of applying this medicine to my son's festering wound, the infection was gone, and a few days later, he was healed. The more I thought about it, I was more and more assured that it was the voice of God that saved my son, and I felt compelled to use this knowledge to help others. You see, our area was sparsely populated. There was no such thing as doctors or drugstores, and for every 2 babies that were born, only one of them would see their first birthday. So that fall, John brought back several books on plants that he purchased on his trip down to the valley, and for the next few months, he would read those books to me every night by the firelight. Over and over again, he would read them, and each time the sun rose the next day, I would roam the forest until I'd located each plant. This repeated itself over and over until I knew where every plant, tree, herb, and bark of medical value was located in the wilderness, in a time when there was no such thing as women doctors. Slowly, I had learned how to mix each of these medicines to cure all sorts of sicknesses, and before long, folks began calling me Dr. Polly.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit the appalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
That's right. Dr. Polly became famous all over the hills and hollers of North Carolina. She was a skilled horse rider, and it was a common sight to see her ripping down a trail, riding side straddle on a bear hide atop her horse, rushing to the aid of some poor soul suffering from the fever, or setting broken bones from an injured logger, or rushing to the aid of a sick baby, in a time when there was no such thing as modern medicine in these mountains, mainly because it would take weeks to transport it from the closest towns over and through the vast wilderness. Dr. Polly kept a saddlebag full of medicines that she had made from the bounty of nature. Now, prior to the war between the states, Polly was famous for riding her favorite horse, a black stallion, to the aid of the sick and the helpless. Yet, when the war broke out, Union soldiers came through and stole all the mountaineers' horses. When General Stoneman of Sherman's cavalry saw Polly's black stallion, he had to have it. Yet, the beast was notoriously stubborn to everybody except Polly or Jim. The soldiers tried over and over again to saddle the horse, to no avail, as the horse bucked and kicked and resisted. Finally, they put a gun to John's head and forced him to saddle the horse and lead it out of the stable. Just like that, Dr. Polly's famous horse was stolen and taken away to the bloody war, never to be seen again. Polly was devastated, so John bought her a beautiful white horse, even more magnificent than the black stallion, and from that day on, she was seen galloping to the scene of countless medical emergencies on her white horse. Polly never refused any patients, and she never earned a dime from her services. But no matter if it was day or night, she could be seen dashing through the wilderness, even in the dead of the winter in the middle of a snowstorm, to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, or galloping through the gaps on her way to Bear Wallow. And as she aged, she became feisty and feared no beast of the forest, as she rode with her horse and her cornpipe packed with homegrown tobacco firmly clenched between her teeth. And during her lifetime, Dr. Polly had 13 children of her own, with 9 of them living into adulthood. She devoted her entire life to helping others. Her husband John died when he was 95 years old in 1901, and 3 years later, Dr. Polly, who was 83 years old, was laid to rest right beside him and both her parents in King Cemetery in Henderson County, North Carolina. Her tombstone reads, Dr. Polly King Justice. She dedicated her life to the sick and the afflicted.
Dr. Polly was truly a legend. Let me know what you think about her story in the comments below. Coming up, more of the greatest women to ever call Appalachia home. Coming in at number 8, we head to the hills of Virginia for Mary Bremler's story. This story is so remarkable that they made it into a book, and I'm completely honored that she allowed me to share it with you now.
On a breezy October afternoon, I was born in the same mahogany bed in which I was conceived. The bed stood in the largest room of the 2-story bungalow on the road that dead-ended at our house and ran beyond the mill pond toward Hillsville, Virginia, and the Appalachian Trail. That day, my father and his sister, Aunt Mary Ann, helped me through a difficult passage into this world. And according to Daddy, I responded with the smallest cry he had ever heard. They named me Mary after my aunt, as a reward for her bravery in assisting an ordeal for which she had no training and little or no experience.
Now, Mary's pa, he had spent his life building a dairy farm, one that he said was the finest in Carroll County. He purchased an incubator to speed up the production of hatching chickens, and his cows were producing some of the finest grade A milk. He was a hard-working man. He was always thinking about the future. Yet, dark clouds were on the horizon all across America, and Appalachia was no different. All the banks were going belly up. The price of eggs was down to 3 cents a dozen, and milk was 5 cents a quart. It seemed that Mary's pa spent all his time worrying about the future for their farm. That's right, the Great Depression was here. Up there in New York City, folks were jumping out of windows because they had lost their fortunes when the markets crashed. Here in Appalachia, Mary's Uncle Leonard shot himself with a rifle and died on the front steps of his porch. And his wife, Aunt Dove, she was homeless and distraught, and she came to live with Mary. Just a little while later, Mary's dad's favorite sister, Aunt Cora, died of diphtheria. It was all so sudden. Mary's pa, he had to borrow one of Uncle Arnold's suits just to go to the funeral. Now, Aunt Cora lived just a couple of miles away from Mary, but she had never met her. Pa said she was a good person, but in those days, it seemed like dying automatically improved one's reputation. So, Mary really didn't know what to believe. Mary's ma, she was already sad-eyed, and all these events sank her deeper into depression. Sometimes her ma would go into the parlor and play the piano, and all the kids would gather around her and sing. It seemed like all the songs that she played were about heartbreak and hopelessness. Even when their mom played hymns at the piano, they were all sad. Mary felt like her mother wanted to die, and sometimes she would threaten the kids to just walk out and leave them all. All the brothers and sisters would be crying and beg the mother not to die. Sometimes, when their parents talked loud at night, they woke all the kids up. They were all trying to figure out if it was regular talking or quarreling. And they feared that Mama might run to the mill pond and kill herself. Mary tried to imagine heaven as having squirrels in the trees and cows nursing their calves while grazing in a meadow. She had been taught that God sees everything from his place in the sky, and there he was, checking on Mary through the kitchen window. But to Mary, God's face looked cold and stern, and heaven, it seemed like a distant and lonely place. Sometimes Mary's ma would talk to Aunt Dove about how she felt about having 6 children, pulling at her apron strings, always needing something that she couldn't give them. She complained about doing without things that most people took for granted. One time, when Mary's ma and Aunt Dove were stringing beans together, Mary hid behind the sewing machine and listened to their conversation. Mary's ma told Aunt Dove that she had visions of seeing her dead mother walking up the road from the mill pond. Oh, she missed her something awful. Aunt Dove took a pinch of snuff from a small can and pressed it along her lower gums. Now, I know you're a good and faithful wife. I don't believe I'd put up with what you have to. With all those suspicions, not being allowed to go anywhere. No, it just ain't fair. A woman that works as hard as you, with so many children, gardening and milking, you ought to be able to go and buy clothes and soap whenever you need it. It's awful sad that you couldn't even go and see your mama. One morning, Mary and all her brothers and sisters gathered on the porch to watch as their pa decided it was time for old Tom, their spirited coat, who had come of age, to become a workhorse. Mary watched as her pa whipped and hollered at old Tom. Her mama explained that the colts had to be broken. Whoa, whoa, my father stormed at him and lashed at him again and again with a whip. But old Tom, he reared his head and bucked as their father hit him. Finally, their pa succeeded in putting the bit between old Tom's teeth and the saddle on his back. Old Tom's ears laid back, and his eyes showed white with anger. Mary's mama just smiled at her and said, "A child is just like old Tom. Its will has to be broken, and its spirit has to be calmed, so it can be guided easily." And it was like that when Mary's mama punished her. She locked her in a dark closet when she was a bad girl. Mary would hold her mouth closed as tightly as possible, and she resolved to never speak another word to anyone. You see, Mary was like old Tom, but not in the way that her mama had said. He wanted to be free to jump fences. And Mary, she just wanted to have friends and play games, and she resented her mother taking her anger away so easily. Mary was 4 years old, and she had never even seen another person besides her family. Now, she knew she had kin that lived a few miles from her, but she had never seen them. One morning, 3 young girls on a pony came down the road to Mary's yard. All of them had on pretty blue dresses with anklets with blue designs on them and leather shoes. Mary and her sister Helen stood on the porch grinning, and they ran to them, and they let them pet their pony. Within a few minutes, their mama called from the back door, "Get in this house now." "Why?" Helen asked, as the screen door slammed behind them. "I'm your mother. Don't ask why." The mother, she would always make the girls come in the house whenever people came down the road. Sometimes Mary and her sisters would pull the curtain aside and watch them, but if their mama caught them looking, she scolded them. However, sometimes the girls would catch their mama staring down the road too, with lonely eyes. Now, they never knew the girls' names, so they just called them the 3 blue girls whenever they spoke of them. They imagined that they must have come from a brick house with flowers in the yard, with lots of other happy children. Heck, they must have gotten new dolls every Christmas, and I bet their mothers had hats made with ostrich feathers. Whenever Mary and her sisters would play, they included the 3 blue girls in all of their make-believe stories, and they waited for them to come back one day, but they never did. As the Great Depression rolled on, it wasn't long before Mary's pa began to look for a different farm, because, as he said, they might end up in the poorhouse if they stayed there. But at the same time, he got sick and grew weaker daily, and soon he was near death. After much talk of death and burials, Mary's ma and Uncle Arnold decided where they would bury him if he died. Everyone grew quiet, and it was as if Mary's pa had already died. It was a serious scare for the family, but somehow, after some time, he regained his strength and recovered. One morning, Mary looked out the window and she saw her pa examining the sky for the shapes of the clouds and the shape of the moon. He always did this during the planting and harvesting seasons. He would note the direction of the wind to predict the weather, and he was trying to decide if the family should strike out to move for the new farm. Mary's ma said, "The bucket of water is frozen in the kitchen. Do you really think we should risk it?" "Oh, we better go now," he replied. "Looks like a snowstorm's heading this way, and we could be snowed in for weeks." And just like that, Mary's family was on the move. And they were about as organized as a haystack in a tornado, as everyone looked for things to wear on the journey. The wagon was soon loaded up with furniture. They hitched old Tom and old Rhonda and old Frank to the front of the wagon that carried all of their earthly possessions, and they struck out for a new home, Coon Ridge. This was the first time Mary had ever left home in her life. The wagon led the way while the rest of the kids followed on a dirt road with deep, frozen tracks all morning until they came to a fork in the road and turned off to a smaller road which ran along Coon Ridge. As the ridge became more elevated, the wind blew stronger and colder. There were several houses, but there were no people. Mary ran to catch up with her daddy and pulled at his overcoat. "Where's all the people?" she asked. "Watch out," he stormed back. "Stay back there with your mother." And then he turned to look at Mary as she stood letting the wagon pass. "A person would have to be a dad-burned fool to go out on a day like this," he said. And then he muttered to himself, "Unless he had to." By noon, a few snowflakes fell like feathers from a molten bird, lingering in the air. The family took an even smaller road that ran to a wooded area. The wagon could barely get through, since the trees had spread their limbs across the roadway. Once they finally got to the clearing, they saw their new home. It was a gray, L-shaped house that was weather-worn and plain. The longer part of the L paralleled the road, and it sat on a slope. The lower portion stood on posts so high that you could see underneath clearly the other side. The upper portion dug itself into the hillside like a ship that had run aground. It was clear that Mary's family had moved to another dark house. That night, they all huddled around the fireplace as the wood was sparkling and popping. The fire threw shadows on the walls as they all hoarded its heat in their clothing. To their delight, a little mouse came out of a hole near the chimney, and he inspected the new residence of his home, and, in the flickering light, he cleaned his whiskers and satisfied his curiosity before returning to his home. Soon, it was Christmas. All of Mary's siblings walked through the deep snow to the edge of their property and took turns sawing down a Christmas tree. When they drug it back to the house, it was too big to fit in the room, so their pa cut it down to size, while their mama boiled some molasses to make candy and cookies. And she was even in a good mood. Mary and her sisters took turns with scissors, cutting out snowflakes and paper ropes to decorate the Christmas tree. That night, Christmas carried a mystical happiness. The tree was colorful, and it scented the air. The drab room had become magical, as the fireplace and the kerosene lamp sent shadows across the room that flitted about like friendly ghosts. Soon the stories blended together about Santa and baby Jesus, and sent all of them into the realm of miracles and mystery. This was the happiest Christmas that Mary had ever known. Her mama had made cookies and candies, and her and her sisters, they finally got the kind of dolls they had always wanted. They were made of china and had blue eyes and just a bit of hair painted on them. Even the arms and the legs were movable. Mary got an orange to eat for Christmas. She had a hard time deciding whether to peel it and eat it by sections or just poke a little hole in it and suck on it slowly. She finally decided on the latter, and nothing had ever tasted so good. The day after Christmas, Mary's mama had moved the sewing machine into the main room because a man was coming to sign the deed for their old farm that they had just sold to a neighbor. Now this was a big deal because Mary's pa had paid the man $5 to prepare the deed. Her pa was looking frantically for the deed everywhere when suddenly he found scraps of it on the floor. Mary had cut it up to decorate the Christmas tree. He stormed at their mama for not watching them more closely, and her mom blamed him for leaving it out. Mary's pa glared at her sternly and said, "You're a destructive child. A few years ago, there was a little girl who cut up a $5 bill, and her father chopped off her hand with an axe. He bit down hard into a plug of tobacco, wrenched it with his clenched teeth, and he stomped his way to the door, slamming it behind him." Mary held tight to her right hand. Her pa had been merciful. He hadn't even touched her, and her mama didn't switch her, but she felt worse than she had ever felt. And just like that, the magic of Christmas was over, and so was another chapter of Mary's childhood.
Don't worry, folks, there's plenty more to Mary's story available in her book, which is called The Shadows of Appalachia, and it's available on Amazon. Stick around, number 7 is coming right up, and you don't want to miss this incredible story. Number 7 on our list is Kentucky's remarkable story of Maggie Bailey. Let's just say that she was one businesswoman who couldn't be stopped, no matter how many times the law tried.
In many ways, Maggie Bailey was your typical mountain girl, growing up on Pine Mountain, just north of the Virginia-Kentucky border. She was born in 1904 on this rocky hillside farm where her pa barely scratched out a living from the poor rocky soil. Like all mountaineers, they raised everything they ate and made everything they owned. Maggie's days were filled with helping her ma out in the house and her pa out in the field, and tending to all the animals. Being the oldest of 6 youngins, it also fell upon the mountain girl to get her brothers and sisters down to the one-room schoolhouse when learning was in session. But by the time Maggie was 12, she had concluded her career in learning the ways of reading and arithmetic, since her pa needed all the help he could get back at the homestead. Now, money was scarce back in those days, all across the mountains, and there was only a few ways that hill folk could get their hands on some. One way was by selling apples and chestnuts down in the valley, and the other, well, that was selling blockade corn liquor. And with so many mouths to feed, and backs to close and feet to put shoes on, Maggie's pa did what he had to do to make ends meet. And to hear the locals tell it, Maggie's pa was quite crafty when it came to working the old copper kettle under the moonlight. Whether it was a special recipe of apple brandy or a concoction of white mule so powerful that it would make a fella hallucinate, his spirits were sought after by folks from all over Harlan County. So, from a young age, Maggie spent many a night standing barefooted on the top of a split-bottom chair with a long wooden paddle, stirring her pa's mash and keeping the firebox stocked with plenty of firewood. Little did she know, but her pa's nightly schooling on the fine art of crafting white mule would end up defining her life. By 1921, Maggie was 17. Her father had hired her out to a local boarding house where she worked as a waitress in the kitchen to help supplement the family's income. Oh, these were exciting times. The newly built railroad brought strangers from all over America who were looking to make their fortune in the coal boom that was well underway. The roaring 20s were in full swing, and the trains brought many strangers from faraway cities who wore fancy clothes while staying at the boarding house. It was here that Maggie met a professional gambler and a coal businessman who dressed in fancy suits and even had the first pocket watch that the young girl had ever seen in her life. She told him about a business plan that she had thought of, and it was sure to make her a fortune if she only had an investor. Although the businessman was reluctant, Maggie had a way about her, and she eventually convinced him to give her thousands of dollars to fund it. And what a genius plan it was. You see, coal towns were literally springing up all over the county, nearly overnight, and Maggie had taken notice of the thousands of brawny men that the railroad brought in each month. These same men emerged from the dark coal mines each evening with a powerful thirst for something to knock the dust out of their guzzle. But you see, a new law had recently swept across America called Prohibition, making alcohol illegal across the nation. And that's where Maggie's plan came in. She knew exactly how to make her daddy's white lightning. Even better, during this time in history, the law frowned heavily on arresting women. Heck, it was illegal to even search a woman. And if a fella did arrest a woman and bring her into court, the jury just knew that no woman was capable of committing a felony, and she'd quickly be released and the charges dropped. Indeed, it was the perfect plan, and she quickly rented a house on the outskirts of town where she turned it into a moonshine factory, capable of producing hundreds of gallons of untaxed liquor at a time. Before long, she began selling the bulk moonshine to speakeasies that served her secret recipe. That's right, she had a monopoly on the entire market, and for the most part, no one had a clue that a sweet young lady was making all this potent drink that would knock a grown man on his ass. For the entire length of Prohibition, Maggie Bailey's moonshine reigned supreme in eastern Kentucky. But the sudden end of Prohibition threatened to shut her operation down. Nearly overnight, legal taverns and distilleries sprang up selling taxed liquor. Yet their product was something new that locals called red whiskey, and most folks thought this was the end of Maggie's operation, since only men were allowed to own liquor businesses. Yet Maggie was now 31 years old, and she had been running liquor for 14 years as an independent businesswoman. She had even used the money to pay for all her siblings' schooling and to pay off her pa's farm. She wasn't about to just give up and quit, so she did something unthinkable. That's right. In April of 1934, Maggie Bailey became the first woman to obtain a legal liquor license and named her business Meg's Place. Oh, she could sell legal red whiskey just as good as any man. But the folks in Appalachia didn't care too much for this new type of whiskey. What they wanted was good old moonshine. And before long, Maggie Bailey was selling legal whiskey out the front door and Mountain Dew out the back. All the way through the Great Depression, her business thrived. So much so that eventually, federal revenue officers wanted to have a look-see at what made Meg's Place so special. In 1941, armed with a search warrant, federal agents burst in and seized 150 gallons of moonshine and promptly sentenced Maggie Bailey to 2 years in federal prison. They shut her entire operation down and seized all of her equipment, making sure to put an end to this moonshine mistress. On the day Maggie was to report to prison, she first stopped by her sister's house to tell her goodbye. And she also left a suitcase there and told her she'd pick it up when she got out. Just like that, they hugged, and Maggie spent the next 2 years locked behind bars. But I tell you this, she put that time to good use. That's right, she spent the entire time incarcerated, studying the law, particularly the Fourth Amendment, dealing with search and seizure, she became an expert on that law, determined to never get caught red-handed again. And, as it turns out, this knowledge would define the rest of her life and leave the law helpless to ever stop her again. By 1945, Maggie was back on the streets and up to her old habits again. The first thing she did was stop by her sister's and pick up that suitcase, which just happened to have $80,000 cash in it. She used that money to buy a house on the outskirts of Harlan with the intent on reopening her business. Yet, there were two problems. The first was that she could no longer get a liquor license because of her felony. And the bigger problem was that Harlan County was now a dry county. That's right. No alcohol of any kind was allowed. But you see, Maggie Bailey was a red-blooded Appalachian mountain gal who was used to solving problems when others would simply give up in the face of adversity. She quickly hired several runners who would make daily trips back and forth to neighboring counties, returning each time with trunks full of beer, wine, and whiskey. Meg's place was back in business, and this time operating more as a drive-through. Folks would simply pull up in the backyard, place their order, and off they went. For nearly 3 decades, Meg's place sold illegal liquor 7 days a week, and the law was furious and desperate to stop her. During the 1940s and 50s, Meg's place was raided 62 times, and each time the law would find liquor in different places, mostly hidden in junk cars or various outbuildings. And each time she was arrested, the charges would be dropped because the search warrants wouldn't specifically authorize the search of her new hiding place. And even when the law had solid evidence, the jury would simply find her not guilty. You see, by now, Maggie Bailey was an older woman and had become a pillar of the tight-knit community. She had paid for college for several of her neighbors' kids, and many times, folks who didn't even have anything to eat would knock on her door, and she would stop what she was doing and cook them a hot meal. Maggie knew every one of her customers. Each visit to her house, the visitors would have to sit a spell, as she asked how your mama was doing, and when was the last time your daddy came to town. She refused to sell to kids, drunkards, or women. After all, Maggie had a good image to keep up. Even folks with political aspirations would pay a visit to Maggie, asking for her vote, because if Maggie supported you, the entire county would. Still, police raids continued all the way through the 1960s, and in 1965, a routine raid on Meg's place resulted in a discovery that would make headlines all across the nation. A score of deputy sheriffs and highway patrolmen were busy confiscating over 200 cases of beer and 50 cases of whiskey when one cop decided to have a look in Maggie's closet. Hidden down in a corner, he saw 14 brown paper bags and a dozen old socks. And wouldn't you know it, every one of them was filled with $100 bills. The cops claimed that there was $480,000 cash hidden in her closet. "Oh, that's hogwash," Maggie claimed. "It was only $372,841 and not a penny more. I know, since I count it every single night." You see, aside from helping others, Maggie had saved every dime she had ever made. She never bought clothes from anywhere, and she only wore secondhand clothes from her sister. She'd never owned an automobile or even went to a movie. Even with all that money, she still kept hogs and chickens and a milk cow and raised all her own food. Yet the IRS quickly took note of the large pile of cash, and they also noticed that Maggie had never paid income tax. So they sued her for $1.37 million. But the IRS was about to find out what the local police already knew. You couldn't beat Maggie in court. Astonishingly, Maggie was able to negotiate all the way down and paid only $18,000 in a settlement. The law had pretty much given up on stopping her. Every time she was arrested, the sweet old lady would show up in court with her printed dress and her baby blue sweater, and the charges, they would be dropped. So Meg's place kept right on raking in the dollars, all the way through the 70s, the 80s, and even the 1990s. Maggie Bailey had began her moonshine career at the tender age of 17 and continued to sell white lightning and bootleg liquor all the way until she was 95 years old. A career of 78 years. In total, she was arrested 114 times, with the last time being when she was 79 years old. But amazingly, she was only convicted one time. That is before she became a legal expert in the Fourth Amendment. Maggie Bailey, one of the most courageous and defiant Appalachian moonshiners in history, died peacefully in 2005 at the age of 101 years old. So, my friend, next time you crack the seal and you pour yourself a strong one, tip one back in honor of Maggie Bailey, the Appalachian legend.
You tell him, Maggie. What a woman. Stick around, folks. Number 6 on our countdown is coming right up. Coming in at number 6, out of North Carolina, is the incredible true story of Katie Sage. Prepare yourself for one of the most remarkable stories ever told.
The morning fog rolled over the mountains in the distance, and the first glimmer of the sun peeked above the trees and kissed the valley below. Young Katie was the first of her siblings to climb down from the upper loft in the rustic cabin. Her mother, Lovis, had already begun to prepare the morning breakfast. One by one, the children piled into the kitchen and gathered around that old table, eager for fresh biscuits. There was even a smell of bacon in the air. Katie always sat at the end of the table, opposite of her pa, since she was only 5 years old. Despite her age, she was already a hard worker, and her father, James, knew it would be a busy day. Well rested from yesterday's church services, he was anxious to get into the fields for an early start for what was sure to be a long day. It was the final hoeing of the year for the large crop of corn. "You 4 boys fetch the shovels and the rakes out of the lean-to. I'm gonna head out and hook up the mules. Those clouds look like falling weather will be here in the next couple days, and I reckon this will be our last chance to get that corn ready for the harvest," the father said. "Katie, finish up your grub and help your ma." "Yes, Pa," she replied. Truth be told, though, Katie longed to be big enough to go out in the field with the boys. In her young mind, there was freedom out there on the farm, and what a farm it was. James Sage had acquired a land grant of 400 acres in Grayson County, Virginia, as payment for serving twice in the Revolution. Yet, Katie knew to mind her pa, and it was a fact that her mother needed all the help she could get, raising a large pioneer family, isolated on the frontier that was still contested by the natives. Before long, the chores of the day were underway. Once the cabin was clean, Katie and her mother took a large iron kettle to the creek that ran behind the house. The curious girl walked barefoot along the water, fetching broken branches, sticks, and twigs to fuel the fire underneath the primitive washing machine. "Stay here and tend to the fire while I fetch the clothes from the house. I'll be back directly," the mother directed. "Yes, ma'am," the mountain child replied. Katie stood still beside the huge pot of hot water and watched her mother walk towards the homestead until she faded into the morning fog. Yet, as her mother walked, something inside her compelled her to look over her shoulder, back at the young girl who had already abandoned the iron kettle and was running towards the hayfield, chasing a group of butterflies. "Oh, Katie," she smiled. "Such a curious and adventurous soul." However, things aren't always as they seem, even in this mountain oasis. You see, there was something else hiding in the fog on this morning, at the edge of the woods. Something evil, some unknown stranger, both desperate and harboring unthinkable intentions. And there he waited, silently watching the young girl and waiting for just the right chance to steal her. And, unknown to Lovis, this would be the last time she would ever see her daughter. As young Katie chased the butterflies, a desperate outlaw snatched the young girl. She tried to scream, but he held his hand over her mouth and throat tightly. His hands were rough as sandpaper on her face. "If you make a sound, I'll kill you and your ma," the outlaw demanded. Within seconds, he threw Katie on his horse and disappeared into the dark woods. It was only a few minutes when Lovis arrived back at the creek with the family's laundry. It was eerily quiet, with the only sound being the crackling of the burning wood from the fire.
"Katie!"
she called. Over and over, up and down the creek she ran, becoming more frantic by the second, but she was nowhere to be found. Gripped with unthinkable fear, she fetched the girl's father, and the search continued all day until both the valley and the ridges were submerged into darkness. The next day, the search continued with all the neighbors joining in the search, but there was no trace of Katie. The 5-year-old girl had vanished into thin air. Unknown to Katie's family, the kidnapper had gagged and bound the child, and he had taken his victim far into the rugged terrain, traveling on horseback for hours through the old Indian trails and along the creek beds. In less than an hour, they had traveled nearly 4 miles when they arrived at Taylor's Mill Falls, where the scared child was forced to climb the steep rocks to the top of the waterfall. Once they reached the top, the desperado continued with the stolen child to the top of Big Ridge Mountain before reaching a small gap to escape to the other side of the mountain range. By now, the outlaw was confident that he had escaped with his young victim and was no longer concerned with her calling for help, so he removed the gag from her mouth. Completely stricken with fear, Katie was too afraid to even speak. "Where is he taking me? Will anyone ever find me?" she thought. By now, they had traveled nearly 8 miles from Katie's home, completely on the other side of the mountain ridge. It was clear that this bandit knew his way through the forest. Following Kilm's branch all the way to adjoin Middle Fox Creek, the unknown man stopped just enough to water his horse and commanded Katie to drink from the creek. Within minutes, the rest was over, and the pair pushed on through the Laurel and the Greenbrier, 4 more miles until Fox Creek widened out a bit, but was still shallow enough to be forded by a horse, and the horse had been ridden hard. By the time they reached Wilson's Creek, the kidnapper had traveled 16 miles from Katie's home in the span of only 5 hours. By now, it was just past 1 p.m. They crisscrossed Wilson's Creek for another 2 miles before resting at Hilton Creek. The trail began upward again as they climbed a new set of ridges and bluffs, past Horse Creek and the North Fork of the New River. The only thing that could stop the outlaw proved to be the darkness. By the time nightfall arrived, Katie's parents had spent the entire day looking for her desperately on their family farm. Yet the scared child was now over 30 miles away from her home. Katie was too scared to even eat the food that she was offered. Imagine for a moment what was going through her mind. The entire day, traveling through unknown land, it seemed it would be impossible for her to ever find her way home. The kidnapper wasn't going to take any chance on Katie slipping away during the night, so he tied her hands together by her waist, and he wrapped a blanket around her and tied a rope around the blanket tightly so that the frightened child couldn't move. He then tied the other end of the rope to a small tree, and then he laid his bed on top of the rope. It was impossible for her to even try to escape. Katie passed out from exhaustion, and sunrise came quickly, and the two were on the move again, following the New River. Within a few hours, they reached the Virginia state line. Just like that, within 24 hours of her abduction, little Katie had been smuggled to a small Cherokee trading outpost in Tennessee. Katie had never seen Native Americans before. She couldn't understand the strange way they were dressed. Even the children. This outpost wasn't a permanent home. Instead, it was a marketplace of sorts, where the natives traded with the white man. Now, Katie didn't know it, but it was in that moment that the man who kidnapped her traded her to the Cherokees for a horse. Suddenly, she was surrounded by everyone speaking in a language she couldn't understand. All the native children just stared at her. The entire situation seemed completely unreal, yet there she was, hopeless and helpless. An Indian squaw fed the child jerky and corn, and that night, Katie made a pallet on the floor next to these strange Cherokee children, still completely emotionally, spiritually, and physically exhausted. She collapsed into sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, sunrise came again. The entire group of natives consisted of less than 20 men, women, and children. Katie was the only white girl in the group. Although she was completely worn out from the travel of the 2 previous days, the group mounted horses and headed north. For the next 4 days, they traveled through Tennessee and Virginia following the New River, only stopping to water their horses and camp. On the 5th day, the group reached a place called the Narrows in Virginia, where they loaded everyone onto 3 canoes. Young Katie had never even seen a boat before, but for the next 5 days, they traveled nearly 200 miles down the New River and then the Kanawha River through some of the most untamed wilderness known to any white man. Some of the waters were so treacherous, they were forced to carry the canoes for miles at a time before returning to the water. Onward through West Virginia until the Kanawha poured into the mighty Ohio River. And so it was. 24 days after she was stolen from her mother and her father, the young girl arrived in the nation of the Wyandot Indians in Ohio. The Cherokee Indians brought her before the Wyandot chief, Tarhi. The wise old man was instantly fascinated by the white girl with blue eyes and blonde hair. The chief had a lengthy discussion with the Cherokee regarding how they had come in possession of the white girl. Satisfied with their answers, the chief accepted Katie as a gift from the Cherokee warriors. From this moment on, young Katie would be called Iroquois and was officially a Wyandot Indian, as if their blood flowed through her veins. Back home, Katie's father was devastated from her disappearance. He had completely abandoned his crops, and he spent the entire month looking for her, day and night, even when all others had given up hope. Now, back in those days, when all options were exhausted, it was common for folks to consult a mountain witch, women who could foretell the future. And during this era, the most famous granny witch that there was Granny Moses. She was legendary in her predictions, so much so that folks feared her. But James had no choice. He had to know what happened to Katie, so he traveled from the family farm in Virginia over the mountains to North Carolina. The old woman listened to his story, and when he was finished speaking, there was silence. The mountain witch just stared into his eyes as if she was looking into his soul. James backed away towards the door to leave when she suddenly spoke. "Your little girl is alive and well, but you will never know her fate or see her again till the day you die. However, one day in the far future, your wife will learn of your daughter's fate and her location, but she too will die before she ever lays eyes on her again." The woman's words tore his heart right from his chest, and part of him died right then and there in that small cabin. Just like that, her family gave up all hope of ever finding her. Within a few years, Iroquois's mind had completely blocked out the first 5 years of her life. She did her best to forget about her blood siblings, even her ma and her pa. As terrible as this entire tragedy had been, she was lucky to have ended up with the Wyandot Indians. They had a well-known reputation for being kind to their captives, and this was especially true for Iroquois. From the moment she arrived, everyone from children to men to women admired her, and as she grew, she became a beautiful teenager. And when she was 17 years old, she was married to Chief Tarhi, the same chief who had accepted her as a gift from the Cherokees. Somehow, through the most unlikely of journeys, the young Iroquois was now the queen of the Wyandot nation. And so it was. She lived her entire life with the Wyandot tribe. She would marry 3 times, once to a great warrior and twice to chiefs. In 1817, she was granted a portion of the 148,000 acres of land in Ohio by the United States government in the Treaty of the Wyandot. She became a wise, respected leader of the Wyandot Nation. And as the United States continued to steal Native American land, the natives, including the Wyandots, were forced westward. Iroquois and her people eventually moved to Kansas. Her life had taken her from her blood family in Virginia at 5 years old. She had spent the next 56 years living as one of the Wyandot Indians, serving as their queen, when one day something very strange happened. On March 10th, 1848, the queen was approached by a Wyandot interpreter. He told her that he had met a mysterious white man who had a striking resemblance to Iroquois. Even his voice was similar. The white man had told him that once he had a sister, but she disappeared when she was 5 years old, and that he had never seen her or heard from her again. But that was over 50 years ago, he said. You see, it turns out that Katie's brother, Charles Sage, was a trader working for a large company, and his work had taken him from his home in Virginia all the way out to Kansas. Iroquois was stunned. She had locked all those memories away inside of her decades ago. She could barely remember her siblings, or her mother or her father. She didn't even know how to speak English anymore. Yet, something inside of her must have remembered, and he compelled her to arrange a meeting with this white man. A couple of weeks later, the meeting took place. There the Wyandot queen stood, face to face with her long-lost brother, a stranger who she had never really known. An interpreter was present as both the Native American queen and her white brother asked many questions of each other. She could only remember that she was kidnapped by a white man. She had erased all the memories as a defense mechanism. Charles Sage was convinced that Iroquois was his sister. A few weeks later, he visited again, this time bringing his older brother, Samuel, who was 11 years old when the young Katie disappeared. He recognized her immediately and verified a scar on her leg and her back from a burn she had when she was young. "We have to tell you something," the brother stated. "Our mother, your mother, is still alive, and she still lives at our family home in Virginia, the exact spot where you were kidnapped. We've told her about you, and we've never seen her cry so many tears of joy. She wants to see you, and we've made arrangements for you to travel from Kansas to Virginia, if you will agree to come." The proposition was met with a long silence as the woman, wise beyond her years, who had endured so much and traveled so far, entered deep thought. For her, life's journey had come full circle. She realized that in her white brother's mind, she was forever frozen in time as a young girl named Katie. They had so many questions, and they had carried a burden of sorrow for her in their hearts their entire lives. So too had her mother, who even in the last years of her life still held on to her love for Katie. After some time, she finally spoke aloud. "I have two families. One that brought me into this world and loved me, and I loved them, but I lost them long ago. It is impossible for me to do as you ask, for I must stay here with my people, for they are my children, and I, Iroquois, am their grandmother." And just like that, just like the Granny Witch had predicted nearly a half a century earlier, Katie Sage's father would die before ever learning of his daughter's fate. And although Katie's mother eventually learned her daughter's story, she never saw her again in her lifetime.
So what about you? What do you think? Should Katie have went and visited her mother one last time? Let me know in the comments below. And stick around. Number 5 is coming right up. Next, we head to the hills of Alabama. Coming in at number 5 is the amazing true story of Granny Dollar. I hope you enjoy this.
In 1926, one of the most incredible events happened in the mountains of North Alabama. A group of school children were startled when a feisty 100-year-old Native American woman suddenly appeared from the thick forest that surrounded their school. There, standing on their playground, was a towering 6-foot-tall Cherokee woman toking on a cornpipe with 6 chickens and a dog behind her, like a living ghost from a long-forgotten era. Her husband had just died, and now she was homeless. But who was she, and where did she come from? Well, my friend, I'm glad you asked. and this is the incredible true story of the life of Granny Dollar. Nancy Callahan Dollar was the last surviving member of the last surviving Indian family who lived in the area now known as Buck's Pocket State Park. She was born in 1827 beneath a spreading button tree to her half-Irish and Cherokee mother and her full-blooded Cherokee father named William Callahan. It was here that young Nancy would spend her childhood, playing Native American games such as dog and fox. Nancy and her siblings never attended school. Instead, they worked the fields alongside their mother, growing corn and potatoes. Well, Nancy did go to school for one day at least, as she told it. But on the first day there, a boy was going around bullying all the girls, pulling their hair and such. And when he got to Nancy, she pulled out a bowie knife from underneath her dress, and after putting it to the boy's throat, the teacher told her to never come back again. So that was the end of her public education. Nancy's father was a towering man, standing 6'5" at 275 pounds. He was powerful strong, and Nancy always said he was like an Indian Goliath. Like all Cherokee men, he was a master fisherman and hunter. Thus, he spent all his days providing meat for his family. One day, when Nancy was a young girl, her father came home with a large buck, and the family celebrated. There was a large feast that night. But her father appeared sad and wouldn't eat a single bite. His wife questioned him relentlessly until he finally spoke. "I cannot eat my meat," he said, "for fear that my Cherokee wife and my 3 little children are hungry tonight. They're in South Carolina, and I was forced to leave them there." Upon hearing this, his wife replied, "Go and fetch them. There's plenty of room here and plenty to eat." Now that statement might strike many folks today as odd, yet it was very common for Cherokees to have more than one wife back in those days. And after all, as Nancy would later recall, her mother truly didn't mind. Indeed, she greeted the new arrivals with warmth and joy. The day they arrived, she had baked potatoes and venison prepared in her brick oven to celebrate their arrival. And afterwards, the 2 women labored, working the crops and having babies. Both women would each have a set of triplets, and all told, there were eventually 26 kids. The family was literally a tribe. They fed on turkey, venison, fish, cabbage, corn, pumpkin, squash, hominy, and johnny cakes and molasses, all of which was cooked in the red clay oven that was outside of their home. By the 1830s, the family came under attack during the forceful removal of all natives, known as the Trail of Tears. Nancy's family was forced to hide on the west side of Sand Mountain, near the Tennessee River, before escaping through the woods and hiding at a place called Saltpeter Cave. Now, although she was only 14 years old, each night for weeks, Nancy would sneak 4 miles back through the woods to their cabin and return with potatoes until the soldiers had finally left the area. But their freedom was short-lived, as soon her father was confronted by a white man named Jukes, who threatened to turn the Cherokee's family's location over to the authorities. And in return, Nancy's father bit off the white man's nose and one of his ears. And because of this, the family was forced to move over the state line into Georgia to a place called Marthaville, about 30 miles outside of Atlanta. By now, Nancy was 21 years old, and her Cherokee mother had died. Even worse, her father's hunting and fishing skills were now useless in their new home. Thus, Nancy did all she could to help provide food for her 25 siblings. She settled on mule skinning and driving a covered wagon 30 miles each day, hauling goods from Marthaville to country stores that were located near her home. She greased axles, hitched mules, and conquered the rutted roads that were soaked by rain and baked by the sun as she loaded and unloaded molasses and meat and salt and gunpowder and lead and gun caps and shoes, dishes and wagon wheels and whatever else was available in the wild region. Now, it was a dangerous job, especially for a woman, but Nancy was tall and stout, just like her father. She stood 6 feet tall, and never once did anybody ever try to rob her. Nancy was set to wed a man named Tom Porter, one of the storekeepers that she visited every day. However, the war between the states broke out, and he was shot and killed in the battle for Atlanta. Nancy's father was also shot in that same battle, and before he died, he sent word for his daughter not to ride her wagon back into the city. Yet Nancy already knew. Although she was more than 30 miles from the battle, she later recalled the sounds of the booming cannon thunder that were still burned in her memory, as she couldn't forget the terrible sounds from that battle for the rest of her life. And shortly after the burning of Atlanta, Sherman's troops marched through her farm and ravaged all her crops. Suddenly, Nancy's father and future husband were gone, and she was left to provide for her family, which she did until they were all grown and they started their own families. Yet Nancy grieved the loss of the man she had intended to marry for 40 years. Somehow the woman who had never had a child of her own had raised her own 25 siblings. It was only once Nancy Callahan was 79 years old that she finally married a man named Nelson Dollar. And since they were too old to have children, her husband gave her a puppy named Buster a few years after their wedding. And together they lived a good life. But sadly, after 20 years of marriage, Nancy was widowed at the age of 100 years old. Remarkably, she had raised and outlived all 25 of her brothers and sisters, and now her husband. The woman who had cared for so many was now alone in the wilderness with no one to care for her. So that's how it was that in 1926, Granny Dollar walked out of the Appalachian forest near Lookout Mountain in northern Alabama at 100 years old and appeared on the playground at a private Catholic school for boys during recess with nothing but her faithful 15-year-old dog Buster and 6 chickens. The owner of the school was away on business in California, but the school's nuns took in the elderly woman and put her up in a small cabin on the school property. And Granny, she made herself right at home, immediately putting the 50 schoolboys to work, splitting her firewood and hoeing a garden spot for her, and bringing her meals each and every day. A few months later, the school owner returned and he was informed about the homeless Native American woman that the nuns had taken in, and the property owner agreed to let the fragile old woman stay, rent-free without even seeing her. But to his surprise, the very next day, Granny Dollar walked into his cabin as he sat reading his newspaper. Without hesitation, the feisty old woman started out. "Morning, sir. My name is Nancy Dollar, but everyone calls me Granny Dollar. And I'm an Indian, and us Indians don't want to fool nobody, so I thought I'd come and ask you some questions before I decide if I'm going to live here for the rest of my life." The man put down the paper as Granny continued. "First of all, y'all don't eat no meat at this school. But I tell you, I gotta have a little fat in my biscuits and some fat meat to boil with my cabbage and turnip greens. And I also noticed that y'all don't let the boys chew and smoke. But I just gotta have my bacca. And also, can I keep my dog Buster? I just can't live without him. And what about my chickens? I got 6 chickens. Now don't worry about them getting in your gardens and such. These are Indian chickens, and they wouldn't touch a cabbage or lettuce or any sort of vegetable, even if they were starving. And I have to have my roosters. I love to wake up in the morning,
each day and hear 'em crowing and answering each other. It's just like music to me. Also, I see those nuns making them boys pray every day. And I'm Indian, and we don't pray. We conjure. I hope you understand. Without hesitation, the school owner agreed to let her keep all of those things. But just before Granny turned to leave, she asked one more question. And sir, I've never sat in a rocking chair all my life. Won't you give me that rocking chair that you're sitting in? I'd rather have it more than anything I've ever seen in my born days. So the man stood up, and Granny, at 100 years old, put the chair on her head and headed back to her cabin. So it was. The Catholic school kindly let Granny Dollar live in a small cabin for the rest of her life. Each day, she could be seen wearing blue denim and barefooted, planting flowers and sunbathing and working in her garden, raising strawberries and potatoes and cabbage and corn. Folks from all over East Tennessee, northern Georgia, and Alabama began making pilgrimages to see her, and she welcomed them all nearly every day, with Buster sitting in her lap, who would savagely attack anyone who tried to get too close to her, and then turn and lovingly look towards Granny. All the while she was rubbing on her pet 17-year-old hen that she called Brownie. She conjured visitors' warts and ailments away, told their fortunes by tracing lines on her hand with her rusty pocket knife, and then she would reminisce about the pioneer old days, with stories about where the Cherokees buried their gold, to an endless crowd of spellbound listeners. When asked about the difference between Indians and the white men, Granny once replied, "My father's hut was enjoyed by all, but another race has taken our fields, our forests, and our game. Their children now play where we were once so happy. But the trouble with the white man is they quit working at 50 or 60 years, and when they stop working, they get out of touch with nature, and they wear shoes in the summer that keeps their feet from touching God's good earth. Soon they begin to fail, and then they're dead." During the winter of 1930, Granny fell powerful sick, and she instructed one of her caregivers to open an old chest that she had at the foot of her bed. There, tucked away and wrapped in blue paper, were 23 large $1 bills. She asked them to make sure that it was used for a tombstone for her, and a few months later, Granny Dollar and Buster died. It was then that Granny's last wishes were carried out by the poor mountain community that had come together and filled Granny's bedroom and performed a Native American dance around her body before burying her in an oak casket in the tiny graveyard next to the Little River Baptist Church on Lookout Mountain. Granny Dollar had been asked about death a few days before she died, and she said, "Law, child, I ain't afeard to die. When an Indian gives himself to God, he belongs to God from that time on. And I gave myself to God a long time ago, and I'm just waiting for him to call me home. I know there's angels all around us, if we could just see them. And I suspect that before I go over yonder, I believe God's going to let me see them and let them hold my hand as I'm crossing over."
The top 4 mountain women of all time are coming right up, and we'll be right back. Coming in at number 4, one of my grandma's favorite people to talk about was a lady named Sally Ann, who Granny Tollett simply called the Firecracker. You'll see why.
Granny Tollett had just sat down in her favorite chair under the shade with a wash tub full of purple hull peas as I walked up to the porch.
"Come right in here and sit a spell. I was just wishing I had somebody to talk to. Take that chair right by the door so you can catch the breeze."
She beamed over at me and hitched her chair a little to one side in order to give me the full benefit of the wind that was blowing through the screen porch door. The mountain air was full of fragrances from a field of clover that lay in full bloom just across the dirt road. For it was June in East Tennessee, and clover, as well as the mountain laurel, were running sweet wide over Husky Branch. Granny always liked to tell stories while she was shelling beans, and me, I was a sponge that loved to listen. She moved the wash tub between our 2 chairs, and I picked up a handful of beans to help her out She smiled and said, "Did I ever tell you the story of Miss Sally Ann?" As her slender, wrinkled fingers split the hull of yet another bean pod. "No, ma'am, I don't believe you have." Granny Tollett sat silent for a few moments. She always made this pause before beginning a story, and to me, as a little boy, there was something impressive about it, as she summoned the storytelling ability that few folks possessed. And within a moment, she began.
It was about 40 years ago, and our church was in a terrible need of a fix. The roof was leaking, some of the windows needed replaced, and the floor was just as bare as your hand, like it always had been. Anyways, the men folk managed to get the roof shingled and the windows fixed, and us women concluded that we would get some new carpet. We'd been saving our money for some time, and we had about $12. And I recollect the argument that we had. Some of us wanted to spend it on the carpet, while some women wanted to give it to those foreign missions, as we had originally set out to do in the first place. Me, the way I figured it, if any of those heathen folk failed to hear the gospel on account of us getting this carpet, they'd probably get saved anyhow, somehow up the road. And if we did send the money for missions, they might not repent, and they'd certainly be damned. So it seemed to me, as long as we weren't sure what they were going to do, we might as well keep the money and get that carpet. With the vote split right down the middle, Sally Ann was the one who settled it, and she cast the final vote in favor of the carpet. Well, anyhow, we all decided to take Sally Ann's advice, and we started about appointing a committee to go to town the following Monday and pick out the carpet, when all at once, the group's treasurer, Elizabeth Taylor, spoke up and said, "There ain't no use in appointing that committee. The money's gone. I kept it in my top drawer at home, and when I went for it yesterday, it was gone. I'll pay it back if I'm ever able to, but I ain't able now." And with that, she got up and she walked out of the room. Before anyone could say a word, we seen her going down the road with her head hanging low. And we just sat there and stared at each other in sort of a dazed way. I could see that everybody was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say a word, till suddenly our preacher's wife, who was just as good a woman as anyone ever lived, she spoke up and she said, "Judge not." And them two words was just like a sermon to us. And then Sally Ann spoke up and said, "For the Lord's sake, don't tell them men folk anything about this. They're always saying that us women ain't fit to handle money, and I, for one, don't want to give them any more ground to stand on than they already got." So we all agreed to say nothing about it, and we all kept our promise, except for that Millie Amos. She had mighty little sense to begin with, and having been married only about 2 months, she'd lost what little sense she had. So directly the next morning, I happened to meet Sam Amos walking down the road, and he says to me, "Miss Tollett, how much money have you women got towards that new carpet for the church?" And I looked at him square in the face and I said, "Are you a member of the ladies group of Harmony Chapel Church, Mr. Sam Amos? For if you are, you already know how much money we got. And if you ain't, well then you got no business knowing. And furthermore, while there may be some women folk who can't keep a secret and a promise, dagnabbit, I ain't one of them." And that settled him quick. Well, Elizabeth never showed her face outside her door for more than a month afterwards, and a more pitiful creature you never saw than when she finally came to the prayer meeting. She sat way back in the church, and she was as pale and as weak as she had been through a siege of typhoid, and I recollect it all just like it was yesterday. We sung the sweet hour of prayer, and Brother Parson Page prayed, and then he called on the brethren to say anything they might feel called to say concerning their experience in the past week. Old Uncle Jim Matthews began to clear his throat, and I knew just as well as my name he was finna get up and tell how precious the Lord had been to his soul, just like he had been doing every Wednesday night for 20 years. But before he got started, here come Elizabeth walking down the side aisle, and she stopped right in front of the pulpit. "I've got something to say," she began. "It's been on my mind till I can't stand it any longer, and I've got to tell it, or I'll go crazy. It was me that took that carpet money. I only meant to borrow it, and I thought surely I'd be able to pay it back before it was wanted. But things went wrong, and I ain't known a peaceful minute since, and I never shall again, I reckon. I took it to pay my way up to Louisville. That time I got the news that my daughter Mary was dying. Now you see, Mary was her only child from her first marriage to Tom Watkins.
You know that fella that was killed in the logging accident. Elizabeth went on. I begged my husband, Jacob, to give me the money to go on, but he wouldn't do it. And I tried to get the thought of going to see her out of my head, but I just couldn't. Mary was all I had in the world. And maybe some of you that have children can put yourself in my place and know what it would be like to hear your only child calling to you from their deathbed and you not being able to go see them. I asked my husband 3 times for the money, and when I found out he wouldn't give it to me, I said to myself, well, I'm going anyhow. I got down on my knees and I asked the Lord to show me a way, and I felt sure he would. The next day, as soon as my husband got up and ate his breakfast and had gone out to the farm, I dressed myself, and as I opened the top drawer to get out my best dress, I saw the missionary money. $12. It came right to my head that maybe this was the answer to my prayer. Maybe I could just borrow this money and pay it back some way or other before it was called for. I tried to put it out of my head, but the thought just kept coming back. And when I went down to the sitting room, I happened to look up at the mantel above the fireplace, and I saw those brass candlesticks with the prisms all around them that used to belong to my mother. And all at once, I seemed to see just what the Lord intended for me to do. You know, I had a boarder that stayed with us the summer before last, that lady from Louisville, and she said she wanted those candlesticks the worst kind, and she offered me $15 for them. But I wouldn't part with them then, but she said if I ever took the notion to sell them, to let her know, and she left her name and address on a card. So I went to my big Bible and I got out that card, and I packed the candlesticks and I put on my bonnet. When I opened the door, I looked up the road, and the first thing I saw was Dave Crawford coming along in his new buggy. And he drew up and he asked me if I was going to town, and he said he'd take me. To me, it looked like the Lord was leading me all the time. But the way things turned out, it must have been Satan. I got to my daughter Mary just 2 hours before she died, and she looked up at my face and she said, Mama, I knew God wouldn't let me die until I saw you once more. I tell you now, the church brethren grew quiet and the shuffling of boots ceased, and here and there, some of the women folk took off their glasses and they were wiping their eyes. Elizabeth went on. I can't say this without crying to save my life, but the truth is, Elizabeth never shed a tear. To me, she looked like she had gotten past crying, and she talked straight on just as she had made up her mind to say just so much. And she said she'd die if she didn't get to say so. As soon as the funeral was over, I set out to find that lady who wanted the candlesticks, but she wasn't home. Her niece was there, and she told me she had heard her aunt speak of the candlesticks often, and that she'd be home in a few days and would send me the money right on. I came home thinking that everything was going to be all right, and I kept expecting that money every day, but it never did come before yesterday. I wrote her 3 times about it, and I never got a word back until Monday. She said she had just got home, and she hoped I hadn't been inconvenienced by the delay. She wrote a nice, polite letter, and she sent me a check for $15. And here it is. I wanted to confess to all the ladies that day we decided to buy the carpet, but somehow I couldn't until I had that money right back in my hand to pay back. If that lady had only come back when her niece said she was coming, it would have turned out right. But I reckon it's a judgment on me for meddling with the Lord's money. God only knows what I've suffered. But if I had to do it all over again, if I'm being honest, I believe I would. My Mary was the only child that I had in this world, and I had to see her once more before she went to the Lord. And I've been a member of this church for 20 years, but I reckon you'll have to turn me out now. That poor thing just stood there trembling and holding out that check, as if she expected somebody to come and take it. I saw Brother Silas Petty. Oh, he was glowering at her from under his eyebrows. And it put me in the mind of those Pharisees and that woman that they wanted to stone. And I recollect thinking, oh, Lord Jesus, if you would come right now and take her part. And while we sat there like a passel of mutes, Miss Sally Ann got up and marched down the middle aisle and stood right by Elizabeth. Well, I reckon if anybody's going to be turned out of this church on account of this miserable little money, it better be her husband Jacob and not Elizabeth. A man that won't give his wife money to go see her dying child is too mean to stay in a Christian church anyhow. And I'd like to know how it is that a woman who had $800 when she married him has to go to her husband and get down on her knees and beg for what's her own. Where's the money Elizabeth had when she married you?
Is it down there on that 10-acre farm? I bet it is. Or is it in that new barn that you built last spring? A fine church elder you are, ain't you? Goodness knows what else she would have said, but just then, old Deacon Petty rose up and he was waving his arms up and down. This is just awful. If this woman wants to give her religious experience, why, of course she can. But when it comes to a woman standing up in the house of the Lord and belittling an elder as the way this woman's doing, why, I tremble for the Lord's house. Didn't the Apostle Paul say, let your women keep silent in the church? As soon as he named Apostle Paul, Sally Ann gave kind of a snort, because she was terribly free-spoken. And when Deacon Petty said that, she just squared herself like she intended to stand there to Judgment Day. The Apostle Paul has been dead rather too long for me to be afraid of him, and I never heard Apostle Paul appoint Deacon Petty to represent him at this church. Now, if Apostle Paul don't like what I'm saying, let him rise up from his grave in Corinthians, or Ephesians, or wherever it is he's buried, and let him say so. Because I'm telling you, I got a message from the Lord to the men folks of this church, and I'm going to deliver it. Paul or no Paul, she retorted. And as for you, Silas Petty, I haven't forgotten the time I dropped in to see Maria one Saturday night, and I found her washing her flannel petticoat and drying it before the fire. And every time I've had to hear you lead prayer ever since then, I've said to myself, Lord, how high can a man's prayer rise towards heaven if his wife ain't got but one flannel skirt to her name? No higher than the back of this pew, I tell you. And you say I can give my experience, can I? Well, that's just what I'm a-doing. And while I'm at it, I'm going to do some talking for Elizabeth and Maria and the rest of the women, too. If the Apostle Paul's got anything to say about a woman working like a slave for 25 years and then having to set up to wash her clothes on a Saturday night so she can go to church clean on Sunday morning, I'd like to hear it. But don't you dare say anything to me about keeping silence in the church. There was times when Paul said he didn't know whether he had the Spirit of God or not, and I'm certain that when he wrote that text, he wasn't any more inspired than you are. Now, Job Taylor was sitting right in front of Deacon Petty, and I reckon he thought his time was coming next, so he got up all easy-like, with his red bandana on his mouth, and he started out. But as soon as he tried to start, Sally Ann headed him off before he had even gone 6 steps, and she barked. There ain't anything the matter with you now, Job Taylor. You sit right down and hear what I gotta say. I've knelt and stood through enough of your long-winded prayers, and now it's my time to talk and yours to listen. And bless your life if Job didn't sit down just as meek as Moses. And Sally went right into him. I reckon you're afraid I'm going to tell about some of your meanness, ain't you? And the only thing that stands in my way of doing it is there's so much to tell I don't know where to begin. Now, Job's sister-in-law, Mary, was sitting right behind me, and I heard her say, Amen, just as fervent as if somebody had been praying. And Job, he just sat there, looking like a sheepdog. Dave Crawford started shuffling his feet and clearing his throat while Sally Ann was talking to Job. Sally Ann heard his feet shuffling, and as soon as she got done with Job, she turned around and gave it to Dave. Do you think your hemming and hawing is going to stop me, Dave Crawford? I tell you, before it was over, Sally Ann had her say about nearly every man in the church. She told how Mary Ebrey had to cut up her wedding skirts to make clothes for her first baby, and how John Martin had stopped Hannah one day when she was carrying her mother a pound of butter, and he made her go back and put the butter in the cellar, and how John Davison used to make Ann pay him for every bit of chicken feed, and then he'd take half of her egg money when the chickens got into his garden, and how Abner Page would give his wife 25 cents spending money every time she went to visit her sister. I tell you, that Sally Ann was a masterful sort of woman, and that night it seemed like she was possessed. The way she talked made me think about the day of Pentecost and the gift of tongues. And then she finally got to the preacher, and I'd been wondering all along if she was going to let him off. She turned around to where he was sitting behind the pulpit, and she said, Now, Brother Page, you're a good man, but you ain't so good that you couldn't be better. It was just last week that women folk came around begging money so you could buy a new suit of clothes to preach in. And I told them if it was to get your wife a new dress, I was ready to give. But not a dime if it was going to go towards putting some more finery on your back. I'm tired of seeing preachers walk up into the pulpit in their slick black broadcloths, and their wives sitting down in the pew with old black silk that's been turned upside down, wrong side out, and sponged and pressed and made over till you can't tell whether it's silk or anything else. And when it comes to the perseverance of the saints and the decrees of God, there ain't many who can preach a better sermon. But there's some of your sermons that ain't fit for much but kindling fires, like the one you preached last Sunday on the 21st verse of the 5th chapter of Ephesians. I reckon I've heard about 150 sermons on that text, and I reckon I'll keep on hearing them. Anybody would think that you preachers were struck blind every time you got through reading the 24th verse, for I never heard a sermon on the 25th verse, and I'm going to read the rest of it to you for once and all anyhow. And I'll be danged if Sally didn't walk right up into the pulpit, as if she had been ordained, and read what Paul said about men loving their wives as Christ loved the church, and just as they loved their own bodies. Well, I reckon Parson Page thought if he didn't head Sally Ann off, she'd go on all night. So when she stopped for a breath, he shut the big Bible and he quickly grabbed a hymn book and said, "Brethren, let us sing, blessed be the tie that binds." And with that, he struck up the tune himself. And about the middle of the first verse, the preacher's wife got up and went to where Elizabeth was standing to give her the right hand of fellowship. And then Miss Petty went and did the same. First thing we knew, we was all around shaking hands and hugging and crying over her. It was a regular love fest, and we all went home feeling like we had been through a big revival meeting and got religion all over again. Granny Tollett concluded her story and she smiled at me. At that moment, I realized that all the beans had been shelled. "Grandma, how about you and Papa Coy?" I asked. "Did Miss Sally Ann say anything about you two?" Granny Tollett's eyes snapped back with some fire from her long past youth. "Law, no, child," she said. "Papa Coy was never that kind of man, and I was never that kind of a woman. And as I recollect, we was walking home that night, and your papa said to me, all sort of humble like, 'Well, Mama, I guess you better go get that new dress you was looking at down at Jenkins' General Store last week.' And I told your papa right then, 'Don't you worry about that dress, 'cause it's already a-laying in my bottom drawer right now.'"
We're down to our top 3, folks, and we've saved the best for last. This next story takes us to the town of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, even before the town existed. This is the true story of Aunt Sophie.
She was one of the last true pioneers of Appalachia, a fiercely strong and independent mountain woman. This is the true story of Aunt Sophie. The year is 1805, and Thomas Ogle and his young wife have spent the past 4 months migrating from the state of Georgia across the rugged Smoky Mountains into eastern Tennessee, where the young couple settles in a narrow valley located at the foot of Mount LeConte. The valley was a paradise, the mountains wrapped around it like a mother's arms, isolating it from the outside world. There was a beautiful, crystal-clear mountain river, brimming with fish, majestic timber stands, bountiful wild game, and plenty of fertile soil, everything a man needed to raise a family. So it was here that the Ogle family decided to build their lives. Using little more than an axe, Thomas felled trees and used the logs to build a modest cabin and a rail fence that carved out his little piece of the mountains, and they settled into their new homeland. They named this Garden of Eden White Oak Flats, and here the couple would raise 14 young'uns in this paradise. Over time, a few other families arrived and also made this magical place their home, building a church to worship and educate their children. Because of its isolation, the people who lived here were a hardy breed. They raised all their own food and made all their own tools, implements, clothing, and furniture. They learned the ancient crafts of basket weaving and broom making from the natives who also lived in the area. And for the next 50 years, the small inhabitants of this valley thrived and grew underneath the shadow of the mighty Smoky Mountains. It was here that a little girl named Sophie Ogle was born in 1855. Born of the same pioneer stock as her grandfather, Sophie roamed the mountains barefooted, just as freely as the animals did. She played in rows of corn taller than she was, climbed the sturdy branches of the chestnut trees, learned to spear fish, and was an excellent shot with her father's hog-killing rifle. She followed her pa, who was a lean, weathered man with hands as calloused as rocks, as he plowed the fields or chopped firewood. And he'd tell her, "Sophie, this land's been good to us. It'll keep you safe and feed you if you treat it right." Sophie was a child of the mountains, connected to the land and the animals of the forest. Her mother taught her how to spin wool and weave cloth, to can and preserve, and to make medicines from herbs that she picked from the woods. Sophie would watch wide-eyed as her mother boiled sassafras roots to make tea or pulled fresh greens from the ground to add to the evening meal. She spent countless hours wandering through the woods, learning the songs of the birds and the tracks of the deer. She felt as though the mountains were part of her, in her blood, her bones. Occasionally, travelers or traders would pass through. Their packs would be loaded with things she had never seen: brightly dyed cloth, shiny tin cups, and even a strange little lantern that didn't use fire at all. She'd listen to their tales of far-off cities and bustling towns, places where people lived shoulder to shoulder, where the nights were lit up brighter than the day. She listened to their tales of Roman railroad tracks being laid down south and cities growing like weeds across the land. She watched with fascination, but she felt no pull to join that life. The mountains, her father said, would shield her from the world's rushing tide.
However, little did he know that what was about to happen would forever change this mountain paradise.
So it was. Sophie grew up mountain strong, living on her family farm. She was a fierce, independent woman who was now in her early 20s. Many folks openly wondered why she hadn't been married by now. But the truth was that Sophie was waiting on a man who was just as strong and independent as she was. And that finally happened in 1879, when a man named Tom Campbell was hired to work on the Ogle farm. Now, Tom wasn't much to look at. His clothes were well worn and dirty, and he didn't have much money. But when it came to work, Tom could work circles around other men, clearing the land and chopping wood, mending fences, or plowing all day long behind a mule. Tom could do it all. He himself had grown up just like Sophie, wild and free. And before long, the pair got spliced down at the Baptist church. Tom took all the money he had in the world, $7.80, and he bought 25 acres high atop Harrison Mountain, which overlooked the valley below. The mountaintop, it was a utopia. There was a big spring full of the sweetest tasting water. Dogwoods and redbud trees were flowering, and they were magnets for wild honeybees. Yes, sir, it was perfect for Tom and Sophie. No neighbors, and no one from the outside world to bother him either. Tom got busy building a home for his new bride. He chopped down trees and hewed them into logs for a small cabin that he built to Sophie's wishes. He split boards for the roof and chopped rock out of the side of the mountaintop for a chimney and a hearth. But he still needed boards for the flooring, so he carried them up plank by plank, 2 miles up each trip to the top of the steep mountain. And I mean steep. You see, no 4-legged critter or no wagon or cart, nothing on wheels, had ever made the zagged and twisty climb to the top. All totaled, Tom carried 1,500 feet of pine and poplar up the mountain on his back. And as a wedding gift for Sophie, he even carried a cast iron cook stove to the very top. There the 2 mountain pioneers lived and raised their crops and their children. Tom eventually carried up a baby calf, some chickens, and a pig up the mountain, and he even managed to get a small mule up to the top. That's right, Tom and Sophie had built a kingdom in the clouds, and there, for the next 40 years, they would remain hidden from the outside world. And once their children were grown, each one headed off down to the valley below to start their own lives, leaving Sophie and Tom to live alone with the animals on top of Harrison Mountain. Yet, winds of change began blowing across the hills and hollers, and the outside world began creeping in. First, there was that road that they cut down in the valley, and soon, folks from the outside world were now showing up in automobiles from faraway lands like Knoxville, and they were there to buy the handcrafted items produced by the local craftsmen. Everything from linens, rugs, tapestries, furniture, jewelry, and cigarette boxes, even bookends. With all this new attention from those outsiders, word began to spread far and wide about this majestic valley sitting at the foot of the Smoky Mountains, and by the 1920s, the area even caught the attention of the government. And I'm sure you know by now, the most feared words a man can ever hear is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I tell you, no truer words have ever been spoken. And suddenly, the government decided that all the land the mountaineers were living on should be a national park. Sophie and Tom watched as one by one, all of the small hillside farms were bought by the government, and longtime neighbors moved away. Those who fought the government and tried to remain were simply removed by eminent domain. And let's be honest, eminent domain is just a fancy word for legal thievery. Sophie and Tom were one of the few original families who were able to remain as the small valley was gobbled up by investors. Suddenly, their small valley was becoming a tourist attraction, and even the name was changed from White Oak Flats to Gatlinburg. That's right, Gatlinburg had become the gateway to the Smokies, and tourists began flocking in by the tens of thousands. Hotels sprang up everywhere, and this once hidden oasis was being featured in magazines and newspapers all across the world.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and we're here on site in Gatlinburg, Tennessee at White Oak Flats Cemetery. And this is where Sophia Campbell is buried. Now, she's buried right under this tree right here. And I wanted to go over there, and I actually did go over there, and I was going to film her grave, but I kept feeling something falling on my head, and I looked up, and there's a mama bear right there in that tree, and she's eating some nuts, and I'm not gonna bother her. But anyways, Sophia is buried right under that tree, and she lived during her life on this mountain up here behind me. And when she died, they wanted to take a casket up there and bury her on top of the mountain, but it was so steep they literally couldn't get the casket up there. So they put Sophia gently in a sheet and like a hammock. They brought her down that mountain right there, and they buried her right here at White Oak Flats Cemetery, underneath that tree where that mama bear is now. And now, back to the story.
Before long, tourists learned about the old couple who were still living on top of the mountain that overlooked Gatlinburg, and they began fording the river and making the long climb to the top of the mountain to visit them. They marveled at Sophie's handmade tobacco pipes and Tom's hand-carved furniture. The tourists craved to just sit on the porch and listen to them tell of how the mountains used to be. At first, Sophie and Tom didn't know what to make about all this attention, but being the wily and canny mountaineers that they were, they adapted. They began welcoming the tourists, and Tom sold them hand-carved trinkets and fresh honey, while Sophie sold them fresh, hot pies and handmade clay pipes that she had hardened on the fireplace. The old couple were now living windows into the past, some of the last pioneers who the world now knew as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie. By 1930, National Geographic reporters even climbed to the top of Harrison Mountain to meet the couple who were now in their 70s. Aunt Sophie beamed with pride as she talked about her boy who lived just across the gap, or her gal who had moved off to Alabama. Sophie had spent her entire life in these mountains, and when the reporter asked her if she could have one wish, what would it be? Sophie took a long toke off of her pipe, and with a faraway look in her eyes, she looked out over the mountains that had been her home for so long, and she said, "I'd like to see the ocean with my own eyes." Yet, it would never be, because on a cold winter day in January of 1936, Aunt Sophie Campbell passed away peacefully in the cabin that she had lived in for 45 years, the same one that Tom had built for her. When folks down in Gatlinburg got the news, a group of men shoveled their way through the snow and ice to the top of Harrison Mountain, and they gently and lovingly carried Aunt Sophie's body down the mountain and laid her to rest in White Oak Flats. As for Uncle Tom, now he remained on the mountain with his hunting dogs and the wild animals as his only friends. One autumn morning, as the leaves were turning crimson and gold, Tom sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The world outside was quiet, and there, in the warmth of their cabin, he closed his eyes for one last time, his spirit finally at rest, ready to join Sophie on the other side. The men of Gatlinburg found him a day later, sitting in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his face peaceful. They carried him down the mountain, just as they had Sophie, and laid him to rest right beside her. The last of the old mountain ways were now gone. Today, 14 million people a year visit Gatlinburg. The once small valley, known as White Oak Flats, is now packed full of hotels, restaurants, and gift shops, all owned by multi-billion-dollar corporations. Most folks today visit for moonshine tastings and quick wedding ceremonies. Most of them have no idea of the history of the old pioneers, such as Uncle Tom and Aunt Sophie, who still rest today in a small cemetery just a few feet off the tourist-packed streets. And as for Sophie and Tom's cabin up on the mountain, well, it was bulldozed years ago to build a ski resort, now known as Ober Gatlinburg.
Number 2 on our countdown is coming right up. Stick around. Mahala Mullins was quite a lady. She lived life on Newman's Ridge in Sneedville, Tennessee. She was more than enough to hold her own in any situation. You'll see what I mean.
When folks think about the early days of moonshine, they probably envision a rough and rugged mountain man, carefully tending to a copper still by the light of the moon. Or they picture a fella in a souped-up car, roaring down Thunder Road with a trunk full of white lightning. That's right, it was a dangerous and risky line of work, and it left many folks either dead or locked up in prison. The last person you'd probably think of leading a moonshine operation was a woman. Yet, one of the most notorious bootleggers of all time was one of the baddest women to ever call these Appalachian mountains home. Oh, men feared her, and the law, they couldn't stop her. She was the Appalachian queen of moonshine, and this is her incredible true story. Mahala Mullins was born in 1824 near Sneedville, Tennessee. In her early life, her family thrived and lived a prosperous lifestyle in this remote, isolated area. However, by the 1830s, winds of change began to blow across these mountains. First came the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which resulted in a dramatic increase of white pioneers looking for new land to settle. A few years later, in 1834, Tennessee passed a series of new laws that made it even more difficult for non-whites to own land. Now, Mahala's family was caught right in the crossfire of these new changes. For one, they weren't black or white or Native American. They were Melungeon, a mysterious race of people, sometimes referred to as the lost tribe of Appalachia, and they baffled scientists and scholars for years, up until this very day. Their physical appearance consisted of dark hair and skin, with blue eyes and a unique bump on the back of their head. To this very day, no one truly knows exactly where this exotic race of people came from, or how they got in these mountains. Some have speculated that they were the descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, while others claim they were lost colonists from the Outer Banks. Other researchers claim that they were a mixed race of Indian and African, or even Mediterranean. Wild theories have emerged, stating that the origins of this race began when Hernando de Soto traveled through these mountains in 1540. while others contend that they might be the ancestors of Captain Juan Pardo, who brought an army of 125 Spanish men in 1567, and those men likely intermarried with Native Americans. Like I said, no one really knows how they ended up in this small area of the Appalachian Mountains. But one thing is for sure. Once these new white settlers passed these new laws, suddenly the Mullins had no legal rights to the land that they had lived and worked on for generations. So they retreated to the backwoods, high up the mountain ridges, as outcasts in this new society. So it was. Mahala lived her entire life confined to a 3-mile area atop a mountain named Newman's Ridge. This rugged lifestyle made Mahala as tough as nails. She worked just as hard or harder than all of her siblings growing up. And it was around this time that folks began referring to her as Big Haley. She was a big-boned girl with a stout frame. There wasn't any woman who would dare mess with her. And as she grew into her teens, she was well over 300 pounds of solid muscle. Suddenly, there weren't many men who were brave enough to cross her either. It's said that whenever she sat down to eat a light meal, it wasn't anything for her to devour a whole pig. Heck, she could rip a deep-rooted pine tree straight from the ground with one hand, and could splinter a 2-inch oak board with her bare fist. Folks said she could take her arm, and she could bend a forged iron crowbar with the same ease that any other woman might fold a silk ribbon. Simply put, Big Haley would have been a fitting match for the Hercules of the American lumber camps, Paul Bunyan. Once, when Big Haley was 17 years old, she attended a politician's re-election rally. Now, back in those days, these events took on a carnival-like atmosphere to lure in the mountain folks. They would have all kinds of strongman events to determine who was the strongest man in the area. Mahala decided to enter the men's wrestling competition, fighting with a savage mountain-style assault that would make any brawny brawler think twice about getting in the ring with her. She proceeded to whip every man who dared to enter the ring. Once there were no more contenders left standing, she began fighting against 2 men at a time, where she continued the carnage. She was an absolute mountain of a woman. Her feats and strength caught the eye of a man named Johnny Mullins, who everyone knew as skinny because he only weighed 100 pounds. In a twist of irony, the small man won the big woman's heart, and the unlikely lovebirds were soon married. Mahala would spend the next 19 years of her life pregnant, with 20 pregnancies. Strangely, the more children she had, the bigger Big Haley became. 400 pounds, then 500, then 600 pounds. Many folks speculated that she was much heavier than that, because nobody knew for sure. But soon, she was known as the biggest woman in the entire state of Tennessee. And with all these mouths to feed, and her husband skinny, too weak to perform hard labor in the logging camps, Big Haley knew she had to take matters into her own hands. Now, living up high on the remote Newman's Ridge had some advantages for Big Haley's family. Her cabin was situated at the very top of the ridge. The closest railroad was nearly 16 miles away, and there weren't any roads leading up to the top of the mountain. To get to the top of the mountain, it was 3 steep miles that were nearly straight up. That's right, any prospective visitor or outsider would literally have to rock climb to the top just to get to the homestead. Now, while the soil was too rocky to grow too many crops, the apple and the peach trees thrived in countless great orchards on the mountain. Big Haley knew that it was impossible for her large family to consume the huge yearly harvest of apples and peaches, and it was impossible to transport them down the mountain to the market. But it would certainly be a shame to waste so many apples. So she took to making her own special recipe of brandy moonshine. Now, although Big Haley lived long before the prohibition of the 1920s, many states in Appalachia had already begun to make the manufacturing of whiskey and moonshine illegal as early as the 1850s, resulting in hefty fines of $10 to several $100s, or even prison time. But Big Haley's cabin was isolated enough that she was able to work her trade for quite some time with minimal interference from the law. Now, despite being illegal, Alcohol began to cause other problems for Big Haley's family. The combination of being raised by a rowdy mountain woman with an endless supply of alcohol was a volatile combination that made her children grow up as hot-tempered as her mama, and the best her daddy could do was just stay the heck out of the way. Her sons were heavy drinkers, and the more moonshine they drank, the meaner they became. One son died when his gun misfired during a brawl. As he tried to reload it, another man slit his throat and drug his body to a deep well and threw him right in. Another brother was shot to death in downtown Sneedville during a shootout with the sheriff. And it seems it was impossible for the family to get away from the violence. One son went out to Texas, and once he got there, he was lynched. In another famous altercation, Big Haley and several of her sons had a shootout with the Confederate soldiers who had come to burn their cabin down during the Civil War. One of her sons had his finger blown clean off, and the other was shot in the leg during the gun battle. And that wasn't all. The family was known to turn on each other as well. One time, Big Haley's youngest son, Willie, got into an argument with his cousin, Coy. And the next thing anybody knew, Willie hit Coy over the head with a shotgun so hard that it popped his eye right out of the socket. Coy quickly pulled his .38 pistol, and he used his only good eye to take aim and shot Willie dead. It's said that when news of Willie's death reached Big Haley, they handed her all of his belongings, which included a full bottle of moonshine. Big Haley took one look. "Oh, it'd be such a shame to let it go to waste. I think I'll drink it myself." Indeed, to say violence was common would be a massive understatement. Yet, perhaps the biggest blow to Big Haley's heart was when her husband died. By this time, she was so big from what folks called the elephant disease that she was confined to her bed where she was propped up 24 hours a day. She had her 3 sons and her husband buried right in the yard so she could be rolled to the front door to witness their funerals. Now, just because Big Haley was confined to her cabin, it didn't slow down her moonshine operation. While most moonshiners would cut their products by adding water or other fillers, Haley's shine was absolutely 100% pure, and word spread far and wide about both its quality and its taste. When she sold you a gallon of moonshine, you got a gallon of unadulterated moonshine, not 2 quarts of moonshine with a quart of water and a quart of carbide all stirred up well and shook before drinking. Folks began flocking to Newman's Ridge just to get a taste of this famous shine. She kept a keg fully stocked right beside her bed with a faucet on it, and for 50 cents, she would pour you a cup right on the spot. Now, it was only a matter of time before the law stepped in to attempt to shut down her operation. Yet, once the revenuers climbed the steep mountain, they realized that Big Haley was too big. It would take a score of men to lift her. Even then, she was too big to fit through the front door of the cabin. Heck, even if they could have gotten her out of the door, there was no way they could carry her down the mountain. Time and time again, the courts issued warrants for her arrest, only to have Big Haley laugh at them and say, "Go ahead, arrest me. Here I am, guilty as ever. I made this shine, and rest assured, as soon as you leave, I'm going to make some more." This process played out over and over again. The best the law could do was to tear down or steal, which her family would quickly rebuild for her. Frustrated, the county judge sent the county's most feared hotshot deputy to shut her down once and for all. And after the deputy failed to bring her in, the judge demanded an answer as to why he hadn't arrested her and brought her to justice. To this, the disappointed lawman replied, "Well, Your Honor, she's catchable, but not fetchable. No matter how many warrants or rewards were issued, she was unstoppable, and folks came from as far away as Europe to get a taste of her legendary shine."
Big Haley, hey Haley, so the best shine in the land. Then he climbed that mountain for a sweet contraband. She got candy, apple brandy, in a cake inside her home. She was catchable but not fetchable, so the law left her alone. My great Aunt Haley was a great big lady that lived all alone. She weighed 500 pounds, but had no thought of her Big Haley, Aunt Haley, so the best shine in the land. Then he climbed that mountain for a sweet contraband. She kept handy apple brandy in a cake inside her home. She was catchable but not fetchable, so the law left her alone.
So it was. Big Haley lived her entire life making shine in the small cabin far atop Newman's Ridge. Like a queen overlooking her vast kingdom of Appalachia, her fame had reached from coast to coast, down into Mexico and up into Canada, with folks making the pilgrimage to her cabin from all over the world. She was never arrested, and she made illegal liquor to the day she died at 74 years old. Now, nobody knows exactly how she died, but the long-standing legend claims that she was poisoned by a jealous rival moonshiner. Even in death, folks didn't know how to get her out of the cabin. In fact, nobody knows for certain how they did it. Many folks claim they tore the chimney right off the cabin and removed her body through the hole. Others said they took her bed and used the wood to build a coffin, while others say she was buried in a piano crate. One thing is for sure, however they got her out, she was buried next to her husband and her sons right there in the backyard. That's right, even in death, she never came down off that mountain. So here we are, over 200 years since Big Haley's death, and folks are still fascinated with her story. So much so that in the year 2000, her cabin was brought down off of Newman's Ridge, piece by piece, and restored in Verde Valley, Tennessee. Even today, you can visit her cabin. And while you're there, be sure to look up at Newman's Ridge. Even with all our modern technology, there's still no roads to the top where the Appalachian Moonshine Queen still rests underneath the apple and the peach trees.
Coming in at number 1, we head to the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, long before that national park was ever thought about. This is the true story of 7 feisty women, and I'll tell you right now, nobody ever fought harder for what was rightfully theirs more than these women did. Our number 1 story on our countdown, this is the true story of the Walker sisters.
The government tried to take their home, but these women refused to leave the mountains that they loved so much. This is the incredible true story of the Walker sisters.
The year is 1866, and John Walker has just returned from the bloody war between the states. It had taken a toll on John. After all, his home state of Tennessee had officially sided with the Confederacy, but John had fought for the Union and was even imprisoned because of his actions. But somehow he had survived and found himself looking to rebuild his life in the Tennessee mountains. John and his wife eventually settled in an area known as Little Greenbrier Cove, where John inherited 200 acres when his father-in-law died. It was a beautiful oasis hidden deep in the rugged wilds. The forest produced a bounty of everything that was necessary to survive: towering chestnut trees, black walnuts, hickory nuts, blackberries, huckleberries, and wild strawberries. John planted apple, peach, and plum trees and cleared land for crops of onions, Irish potatoes, peppers, turnips, peas, tomatoes, cabbages, and, most importantly, corn. The forests were full of wild game: bears, deer, rabbits, and squirrels. John let his hogs run wild so they could fatten up on chestnuts throughout the year. Nature also provided all their medicine, and there was plenty of catnip and pennyroyal, sassafras, turpentine, and balsam oils. Indeed, the mountains provided everything a man and woman needed to start a family. So it was here that John Walker, using an axe and a few primitive tools, built a cabin made of yellow poplar logs, and both he and his wife raised 4 boys and 7 girls. The family of 13 were humble people who lived in harmony with the land. They built a one-room schoolhouse that also served as a church and lived a rich life. And for a time, they all lived in the humble cabin together as one big happy family. Remarkably, all 11 children reached adulthood, and the loving parents were able to see all 4 of their sons move away to start their own lives. They had lived a truly blessed life. But as we know, the hands of time pause for no one. In 1909, John's wife died, and a decade later, John would join her on the other side of eternity, leaving the land, cabin, and his wisdom behind to be carried on by his 7 daughters, Hattie, Martha, Nancy, Sarah Caroline, Margaret Jane, and Polly, the Walker sisters. Of all the women, only Sarah Caroline would marry and move away. In an age when all mountain women married very young, the 6 Walker sisters never married and lived together in the cabin their father had built for them in the aftermath of the Civil War. They raised all their own livestock, spun wool, churned butter, tended the crops, canned vegetables, and smoked their pork just the way their father had taught them. There was no electricity. Instead, they kept all their food in a spring house to keep it cool. Each sister worked as hard as any man ever aspired. In their mountain kingdom, they were isolated from the fast-paced world that was ever encroaching just beyond the hills. Yet little did they know that this new modern world would soon be knocking at their door, led by the federal government, looking to take everything from them. But the sisters were bound and determined to put up a fight with the government that would change the course of history. By the 1920s, the mountains had been looted of much of its natural resources by the wealthy businessmen who ran the coal and timber industries. Gone were the virgin forests, and mining had polluted many of the mountain streams, all in the name of progress. Many folks today don't even realize it, but the mountains were stripped bare back in those days, completely ravaged. And once those companies had extracted their riches, they had no more use for the land. So in the ultimate middle finger to American taxpayers, they sold their large tracts of land to the government, profiting one last time. It was then that many groups began to push for legislation to protect this newly acquired land by declaring it to be a national park. The problem was that there were still thousands of families living in those mountains. In a twist of irony, the very families who had lived in harmony with the land were suddenly forced by the government to vacate their homes and give up their land and way of life. The entire movement was highly controversial, to say the least. Many families saw this as an opportunity to move out of the mountains into a valley town and trade their lives of pioneer living for a life of working in a factory job. But there were also many others who resisted the government, vowing to fight for their land. In their minds, it simply wasn't for sale, and for those folks, the government simply used eminent domain to take the land from them. Yet, among the mountaineers who fought the hardest against the government stealing their land, none resisted as valiantly and as long as the Walker sisters. For over a decade, the state of Tennessee tried to purchase their land or use political coercion to force them off it, but the sisters wouldn't budge. Even though the Great Smoky Mountain National Park was established in 1926, the government had a major problem. The Walker sisters hadn't budged. They were still clinging to the cabin their father had built, and to the only lifestyle they had ever known. Although Nancy died in 1931, the remaining 5 Walker sisters never stopped fighting the government in the courts. However, in the end, the result was that the government took their land and home through eminent domain. Yet, the powers that be knew it would be a political nightmare and public nightmare if taxpayers learned that 5 women were forced out of their homes. So a deal was struck to let them live in their cabin for the rest of their lives. I need to pause here for a moment, because this is where folks will usually say things like, it was a good thing the park was created to protect the land, or they were allowed to live there for the rest of their lives, so it wasn't a big deal. To that, I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts. First, I guarantee that those who had their homes taken by the government would disagree, and I'm willing to bet that no one living today would agree to have their home taken by the government. Secondly, yes, they were allowed to live the rest of their lives in their cabin, but make no mistake about it, they were now tenants, and the government was their landlord. No longer were they able to hunt or grow large crops. The land was now owned by the government, and their self-sufficient lifestyle was stolen from them. With that said, the Walker sisters refused to leave, and despite the new restrictions, they lived the simple life the best they could. They still raised a garden, sheep, chickens, and hogs. They spun wool and made their own clothing and blankets. They once said the only thing they couldn't grow themselves was sugar, salt, and coffee. They were living windows to the past, but it wasn't until 1946 that the public found out about them when the Saturday Evening Post featured a story on them. And soon, people flocked from all over the world to their small cabin to see the Walker sisters for themselves. At first, the sisters were cautious and skeptical about all of the strangers who made the pilgrimage to their cabin. But eventually, they embraced the notoriety and would invite visitors in for lunch or supper. In true Appalachian spirit, they adapted and began selling handmade dolls, hot apple pies, and poetry to the visitors, which helped the sisters make a living. As the years passed, each sister eventually left the world, with Louisa being the last in 1964. Today, their cabin still stands as a reminder of the Walker sisters' legacy, a symbol of resilience and tradition in the Smoky Mountains. It stood sturdy against the elements, filled with the echoes of family stories, laughter, and the quiet sounds of daily work. The sisters grew their own food, tended to their animals, and spun their own wool to make blankets and clothes. They knew the seasons by heart, and each one brought its own set of tasks, gathering firewood for winter, planting vegetables in the spring, and foraging for wild berries in the summer. What set the Walker sisters apart was not just their determination to live as their ancestors did, but the depth of their connection to the land they called home. The rugged beauty of the Smoky Mountains had shaped their lives, and they knew every tree, stream, and ridge like the back of their hands. They respected the mountains and took only what they needed, leaving the land as unspoiled as possible for the next generation. Even in their isolation, the Walker sisters became legends. Visitors from nearby towns and distant cities would travel to Little Greenbrier Cove just to catch a glimpse of these women who seemed untouched by time. The sisters would welcome them with stories of their family's history, offer a slice of freshly baked cornbread, and show off the hand-spun quilts they made on looms built by their father. Though they never sought fame, their way of life became an inspiration to many.
What an inspirational story and true testament of the Appalachian spirit. Today, all 7 of the Walker sisters rest in Maddox Cemetery in Wears Valley, Tennessee. Each tombstone bears the inscription, Sisters. If you enjoy stories like these, I hope you'll consider checking out my new book. It's full of stories just like it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.